Hello everybody, Shrouded Hand here. Today I want to look at a case that is both a horrifying nightmare and a heartening tale of survival. This is what happened when Mary Vincent encountered Larry the Mad Chopper Singleton. It was September 1978. A 15-year-old Mary Vincent stood at the side of the road in Berkeley, California, trying to thumb a lift. Mary had grown up in Las Vegas. A few weeks earlier, she had run away from home. Her parents were going through a messy divorce. Mary decided to flee the house, and she spent a few days sleeping rough around Las Vegas. Eventually, she got a ride to California, and she'd been staying with her uncle there. Now she was attempting to hitchhike down to LA to visit her brother. Eventually, a blue van stopped to pick her up. Unfortunately, it was driven by a man named Lawrence Singleton. Lawrence Singleton had grown up in Tampa Bay. At the age of 17, he'd joined the Merchant Marine and he'd spent a lot of his adult life at sea. In 1950, at the age of 23, he'd been drafted into the US Army and he'd served for 2 years in Korea. It might have been because of the things that he saw in Korea, but court records show that he became an alcoholic in his early 20s. He married twice. His first marriage lasted 14 years and they had 2 daughters together, but over those years his drinking got worse and he became prone to violent outbursts against his wife and his daughters. Eventually they got a divorce. He married a different woman, but once more this marriage was marred by his alcoholism and his violence, and it ended in divorce. Now, at the age of 51, the lonely Lawrence Singleton was driving through Berkeley drinking green alcohol out of a milk jug. He probably couldn't believe his luck when the young Miss Vincent agreed to get into his van. Shortly after picking Mary up, Singleton started acting a little weird. Mary sneezed and, on the pretense of checking her temperature, Larry Singleton reached over and felt her neck. Mary pulled away. The journey down to LA was a long one, and after a few hours, Mary fell asleep. When she woke up, she noticed the van was driving the wrong way, heading towards Nevada. Mary grabbed hold of a spiked surveyor's stick and pointed it at Singleton. She told him to stop the van and let her out immediately. Singleton put on a good act. He apologised profusely and told her that he'd simply taken the wrong turning and didn't realise they were going the wrong way. His apology seemed genuine enough, so Mary stayed in the van and they turned around and headed back towards LA. A while later, heading down Interstate 5 through the Del Puerto Canyon, Lawrence Singleton said he needed to take a toilet break and he couldn't hold it until the next rest stop. He parked up the van in a desolate area at the side of the road and they both got out to stretch their legs. As Mary stooped down to tie her shoelace, something hard smashed into the back of her skull and she fell to the floor unconscious. Singleton had hit her over the back of the head with a sledgehammer. After she fell forward, stunned on the floor, he bound her hands behind her back and forced her to perform oral sex on him. He then bundled her into the back of the van and drove her even deeper into Del Puerto Canyon. Now they were in the middle of nowhere, on a back road where they likely would never be disturbed. As night fell, Singleton subjected Mary to hours of sexual and physical abuse. Throughout her ordeal, she continually begged him to set her free. In an effort to silence her pleading, he forced her to drink the green alcohol until she passed out. When she eventually came to, he was untying her hands, and at first she thought that he was releasing her. He said to her, "You want to be free? Then I'll set you free." He then took a hatchet and hacked off both her arms, just below the elbow. Mary was conscious throughout and she felt every blow. Whilst he was cutting off one of her arms, she desperately reached out and grabbed onto his free hand. After her arm had been severed, it still clung onto him and he flailed around trying to shake it off him. Mary went into shock from the pain and the blood loss. Her body went limp and she appeared to be barely conscious. Singleton, believing her to be nearly dead, dragged her to the side of the road and threw her down a 30-foot drop into a ditch. He then climbed down into the ditch and stuffed her into a drainage culvert that ran underneath the road. By this point, she appeared to be dead, so he left her there in the culvert and drove away in his van. But amazingly, Mary wasn't dead. Somehow, after he'd gone, she found the strength to stagger to her feet. In an attempt to staunch the bleeding, she rolled the stumps of her arms in dirt and mud. Then, somehow, without the use of her hands, she clambered her way out of the ditch and onto the road. She was still in an extremely isolated area and there was little chance of a car coming by, so she started walking, holding what remained of her arms up in the air to try and keep the blood loss to a minimum. She walked for 3 miles before encountering anyone else. Along the way, she passed out multiple times from the pain. The first car she saw sped away, horrified by the sight of this naked girl with freshly severed arms. Finally though, a car did stop. It was a couple off on their vacation. They picked Mary up and wrapped her in towels before driving her to somewhere where they could phone for an ambulance. She was taken to hospital and her wounds were treated. She even insisted on staying awake through the night so that she could give an accurate description of her attacker. In fact, the description she gave was so accurate that Lawrence Singleton was quickly identified and arrested. And you'd think that's where the story ends. Singleton arrested, Mary Vincent survives and she testifies against him in court. He gets sent to prison for the rest of his life, right? Well, you'd think so, but no. According to the law at the time, the maximum sentence that Singleton could receive was just 14 years. And if you think that's lenient, his behaviour in prison was so exemplary that his sentence was effectively cut in half, and after just 8 years behind bars, he was released back onto the streets. Mary had prosthetics installed to replace her missing hands. She also had extensive therapy to help her cope with the trauma of what happened to her. Eventually she was able to marry and had 2 sons. However, after Singleton's release, she lived in constant fear that he would come after her again. Apparently when she testified against him in court, he had walked past her and whispered, "I'll finish this job if it takes me the rest of my life." Now that he was out there somewhere, a lot of those old traumas resurfaced. She never felt truly safe in her own home. Every night she would wake up screaming from horrifying nightmares. As for Lawrence Singleton, life outside prison was pretty difficult. Understandably, people didn't want him living near them. He tried to move home, but locals mounted a campaign to try and get him to leave. Someone even detonated a firebomb outside his house. Eventually, after moving to various different places without success, he settled into a house in Tampa at 7704 23rd Avenue East. By now he was calling himself Bill, and his neighbours, who seemed to be ignorant of his past, described Singleton as a friendly, happy and helpful guy. However, behind closed doors, Singleton wasn't doing well. He was still drinking heavily, and he'd been prescribed an SSRI antidepressant called paroxetine after attempting to take his own life. It seems that after getting out of prison, he'd been slowly spiralling out of control. At 3:30 p.m. on February the 19th, 1997, a neighbour saw Singleton pull up on his driveway and take a woman into his house. This woman was Roxanne Hayes, a prostitute whom Singleton had paid to spend the evening with. Later that day, a man named Paul Hitson and his uncle Robert Music arrived at Singleton's house. They'd been hired to paint the interior of his home, and it seems that Singleton had forgotten that they were coming that day. Paul Hitson noticed that the back door was open, so he went inside, knocking on the door and calling out to Singleton. He says that he heard moaning coming from inside and he thought that Singleton was having sex. Then he heard a woman calling out for help. Hitson entered the kitchen and he saw prescription pill bottles spilled out all over the counter. There was also a strong smell of alcohol in the air. He walked through into the living room and saw Singleton on the couch. He was naked and stooped over between the legs of Roxanne Hayes. Hitson noticed there was blood on Roxanne's thigh. Singleton looked up briefly and glanced at Hitson before returning to what he was doing. His eyes appeared distant and glazed over. Hitson ran outside and grabbed a shovel from his truck. He was about to run back into the house when his uncle stopped him. The two of them stood outside and looked in through the front window and saw Singleton strangling Roxanne Hayes. She called out for help. Singleton started punching her in the face. It was so violent that the two men outside could hear the sounds of her bones breaking. Hitson ran to the front door and started to bang on it, but for some reason they didn't enter the property again. Instead, Hitson and his uncle drove to a gas station and called the police. At 6:23 p.m, the police arrived at Lawrence Singleton's house. He answered the door shirtless and there was a cut on his chest. He told the officer that he'd cut himself chopping turnips. The phone inside the house rang and Singleton went in to answer it. As he did so, the officer followed him in and spotted through a half-open door a woman's foot. He pushed the door open further and saw, lying naked face down on the living room, Roxanne Hayes' lifeless body. She had been stabbed 7 times. Once in the face and 6 times in the body. Some of the wounds had penetrated her heart and her liver. There were also defensive wounds on her hands where she'd attempted to grab hold of the blade as it was being plunged into her. Lawrence Singleton was arrested and charged with the murder of Roxanne Hayes. At his trial, Mary Vincent testified against him. Holding up her prosthetic hands for the courtroom to see, she said, "I was raped and I had my hands cut off. He used a hatchet and he left me to die." Singleton received a death sentence. He never received his execution. In 2001, at the age of 71, Lawrence Singleton died of cancer. His crimes led to the Singleton Bill being drafted. This would ensure much tougher sentences for anyone convicted of crimes that involved torture. Mary Vincent trained herself to draw with her prosthetic hands and she became an accomplished artist. She also regularly advocates for the rights of victims of violent crime. She still suffers from the nightmares, but she can sleep a little easier now that Lawrence Singleton is gone. So I hope you found this video interesting. It's a pretty harrowing case, but I find it pretty inspiring, Mary Vincent's tale of survival. It's cases like this that tend to put things into perspective a little bit. It makes my own problems seem quite trivial compared. So thank you for watching, and thank you to everyone who is helping to support the channel. It's very much appreciated. If you're in the mood for more videos, you can check out the links that are on screen now, or just look out for me in your recommendeds in the future. Until next time, goodbye.